Okay, so Bill Reiner here, the child and adolescent psychiatrist and urologist again. Moving on and talking about adolescence, moving into really what's kind of a part two is the beginning of adolescence. And most of us think about sexual changes in the body as being the beginning of adolescence, but in truth, the early parts of adolescence, the early parts of puberty are the growth spurt that children go through that parents tend to recognize because they can't keep the kids in clothing that fits, and the kids sort of miss. But the kids begin to grow very rapidly, and then many of the secondary sexual characteristics begin slowly to become more apparent. So it's important to realize that some of the emotional aspects of adolescence are going to start making themselves known during that growth spurt as well, because the brain is growing and changing probably very much as fast as the legs and arms are growing and changing, and subsequently the rest of the body. The changes are not the same from person to person. They're largely personality dependent, and personality is something that you start off life with and you end life with, unless you have a brain injury or a major toxic insult. Otherwise, your personality really doesn't change much. On the other hand, the personality grows and develops and changes, but it doesn't really change much. So it's that kind of almost paradox that we grow and develop and live in that we have to face and have to recognize. The personality aspects are very important, but the emotional aspects of the impact of what we deal with in life is very important. So life can be full of insults, and sometimes it can be full of accolades. Tends to be more insulting, I think, than accolade rich. But on the other hand, those insults, those experiences that we have that may have some negative or even large negative connotations can be very important in terms of our own development. Yes, the personality is largely what determines how we respond to those emotional impacts, but sometimes the emotional impact can overcome personality. And this is particularly true in bladder exstrophy, or any kind of a condition where there may be major surgical problems or changes, there may be major illnesses secondary to complications, and so on. Those can be very overpowering. Occasionally they can be empowering, but mostly overpowering. And the adolescent, especially the young adolescent, has a tendency to become overpowered more easily than that same child when he or she gets older. So age and experience are helpful, but nonetheless, the emotional impacts of these things are very important. Now, they're also important for the parents, and that's an entirely different topic, but a very important topic to the parents, obviously, but also to the child, and therefore to the family in general, meaning these are going to impact other children, other siblings in the family as well. Now, for the parents, I think it's there are several points that are very important for the parents. Many times parents will have an episode or interlude with a child that they don't understand. That's probably more frequent than not for most of us as parents. And they'll sort of question themselves and say, who is this child? Well, the truth is they don't know, and neither does the child, but they're all going to know at some point. And as I've said once before, when a child is born, you don't know who that child is going to be. We make great assumptions as parents when our children are born, but the truth is we have no idea who that child really is. We learn that as the child learns that because they don't know either. Well, it's important to realize that in adolescence as well. And one of the aspects of that in terms of parenting that I think is very important is that there are times where you're going to need to stand back or sit back and just observe and sort of say to yourself, I can't figure out what's going on here. Why is my child behaving this way? Why did they react in that particular way? And you may not be able to come to an answer, but if you can sit back and observe and then look at the bigger picture of what's going on in their life, you may understand that you don't know that bigger picture, and that's part of the problem. And adolescents have a great deal of difficulty in telling their parents the bigger picture. Even adolescents who are very open with their parents, as many, many people with bladder exstrophy tend to be. So you have a child who tends to be open and, my kid tells me everything kind of a response, and then you realize that there actually are things that your child isn't telling you about. Well, they need someone to tell those things about. So that's the kind of role that I play. And that's the kind of role that some kind of counselor can play anywhere that you are, but you need to have some kind of contact with a counselor. Does that counselor need to know about bladder exstrophy? Well, they aren't. You are not going to find very many people in the world, other than pediatric urologists and other people with bladder exstrophy, who know anything about bladder exstrophy. Most people will never have heard of it, and if you explain it to them, they aren't going to understand anyway. But you can explain to them some of the key parts, the parts of needing multiple surgeries from infancy on, the parts of dealing with urinary incontinence, the parts of dealing with genital anomalies, the parts of looking and seeming different. Even though when the kids have their clothes on, the kids with exstrophy look like any other kid. You can't tell a kid with exstrophy from anybody else, but don't tell them that. Well, even though in adolescence, the child recognizes that no one else really knows they have bladder exstrophy, they still are dogged by this feeling that other people really know something, or that they might discover something. And they might discover something. They might discover that a child catheterizes to empty the bladder. So those are the kinds of issues that are very difficult for the child to explain and very important for the parent to know about, so that the parent can offer some kind of coping strategies and counseling, especially before discovery or some other issue may occur. Well, the difficulty for parents of adolescents, and the difficulty for adolescents, is communication. It's very difficult for adolescents to put into, well, usually for adolescents to put into words what's really going on, because that's not yet the way that humans formulate. Humans begin to formulate in words when they get older, later adolescence, and certainly into adulthood. Parents, on the other hand, as parents, we tend to think that we know what's going on with our children. Well, we usually don't, or even if we do, we really don't. So one of the aspects that I think can be important from the parent standpoint is, as I've mentioned, to stand back and observe. And when you observe, you can come to a conclusion. And it's quite fair to make that conclusion, that observation, to your child, to your adolescent child. Not in the form of a question, because questions are leading and it can alter the entire interaction. So make an observation. It can be something simple, like, gee, you really seem mad today. And then don't say anything else. Wait to see how the child responds, whatever your observation may have been. Your observation may be wrong. In fact, in my own experience of parenting, it usually was wrong. But that's okay, because the child responds. When you observe something and it's wrong, most likely your child's going to tell you it's wrong. They love to do that, by the way. Well, in the process of loving to do that, if you still listen and don't say anything else, they may actually begin to formulate within themselves the words that go behind what really is going on, what they really are feeling. And once they can begin to do that, then they can tell you, and then you have a real conversation. Then you can come up with coping strategies, and they may not work, or your child may totally reject them, but they're most likely going to listen. And sometimes those coping strategies that they rejected to you, they actually will go back and use and try and adapt on their own. Well, as you can see, if you're the adolescent with bladder exstrophy, I'm talking to the parents about strategies for dealing with you, but realize that your strategies for dealing with your parent can be very similar. You can actually make observations about what's going on with your parent when you don't understand what is happening in a situation. And you can recognize that if they're following my techniques, that they're making observations that may be wrong. So there's nothing wrong with knowing the tricks of the trade on either side, because each of you, if you know the tricks of the trade, you can realize when the other member of the family, the parent versus the child, or the child versus the parent, is making that attempt to really communicate. And ultimately, whether you're angry or sad or happy or whatever's going on, it's the communication that's important. We humans really don't do well with nonverbal communication. We misinterpret it terribly. Heck, we tend to misinterpret verbal communications too frequently. So it's important that we can verbalize our experiences and within our relationships. And this is partly how we grow within a relationship. That doesn't mean you're not going to have tension with your parent, for you adolescents, or vice versa for you parents. That doesn't mean that there aren't going to be blow-ups and upset episodes and anger as well as happiness and whatever. It just means that you can communicate. You can be angry with someone and still communicate. Even yelling, although I admit that's a little tough for most of us. But some people can even communicate when they're jumping up and down and screaming like wild people. Maybe not that much. So these are kinds of techniques that you can try and see if communication can improve, realizing that these are techniques that you need to keep using for the next several phases of life, the next several years probably. In fact, they're useful techniques throughout life, I think, for all of us. And it doesn't matter if you know what the other person is trying to do. So I think these are certainly worth a try.